She's a fraud who can't even keep her marriage together, let alone a clearance. She's just a broken woman playing soldier in a dead woman's house. That's what my aunt said, standing in my grandmother's dining room, holding a wine glass she didn't pay for, in a brownstone she didn't inherit, at a table she didn't set. I didn't flinch. I stayed silent, my hands folded in my lap. She'd find out who I was soon enough. They all would. But not tonight. My name is Wren Ashford. I'm 42 years old. And up until 6 months ago, I thought the hardest thing I'd ever do was decrypt a foreign naval communication protocol under a 90-second deadline in a room with no windows and no name. Turns out, the hardest thing I ever did was sit through a family dinner. I learned the hard way that in the Ashford family, silence was never interpreted as discipline. It was interpreted as weakness. The quiet child became the strange child became the absent one, and the absent one became whatever story they needed her to be. Denial, I would learn, was their specialty. Growing up in the Ashford brownstone meant understanding hierarchy before I understood long division. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat at the head. She was the gravity that held everything in orbit. My father, her eldest son, sat to her right, and my Aunt Marlene, his younger sister, sat wherever she could be loudest. I was the intense child, too curious, too quiet, too precise. I asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, not about feelings, about systems. How does the lock work? Why does the phone ring before you pick it up? What happens to a signal between the tower and the receiver? By 12, I was reading graduate-level mathematics textbooks I'd found in my grandmother's study. By 16, I stopped trying to explain what I was reading. By 18, I was gone. I left quietly, no big send-off, no family dinner, just a rideshare to the airport at dawn and a bag packed with precision. What they didn't know, what I never explained, was that I wasn't running from the brownstone. I was running toward a language that finally made sense. Numbers, systems, signals. I completed my PhD in applied mathematics at 27. The Navy commissioned me the same year. 3 years later, a man in a windowless room at Fort Meade asked me if I'd ever considered that the math I loved could protect people. Not theoretically, operationally. I said yes. That was 12 years ago. 12 years of encrypted communication protocols built for 4 allied navies. 12 years of digital forensics so classified that the operations didn't have names anyone outside a skiff would ever hear. 12 years behind blue monitors in rooms that didn't appear on any floor plan, tasting the metallic bite of recycled air and stale coffee at 3 a.m, while tracing signal leaks across 6 time zones. To my family, I was a data security consultant. Safe, simple, stable, I work in analysis, that's all I ever said. And for 12 years, that was enough to make me invisible. When I stepped out of the taxi on Marlowe Street, the October air in Georgetown hit me like a memory I hadn't asked for. Damp leaves and old brick and the faint sweetness of someone's fireplace 2 doors down. The brownstone looked exactly the same. 3 stories of dark red brick, black iron railings, the front door with the brass knocker my grandmother had polished every Sunday morning until her hands couldn't grip the cloth anymore. She left it to me, the brownstone. Not to my father, not to Marlene, to me. The letter was short, Eleanor Ashford's handwriting, thin and certain. To Wren, because you were the only one who ever listened to the walls. Marlene never forgave that. No one was waiting at the door, no welcome, not even a text from my sister, just the sound of voices already inside, already gathered, already arranged in the formation Marlene preferred. The one where she stood at the center and everyone else rotated around her orbit. I pushed the door open. The old wood groaned the way it always had, a sound like the brownstone clearing its throat. The dining room was set, roast chicken with rosemary, baked squash with brown sugar, cornbread so buttery it stuck to the knife. Marlene had even used the good china, the set with the pale blue rim that my grandmother saved for Christmas. Family photos lined the mantel above the fireplace. Sarah's college graduation, Sarah's first day at her architecture firm, a candid of Marlene at some charity gala, her arm draped over a man I didn't recognize. 3 photos of my father's old law office, not a single one of me. They hadn't just forgotten me, they'd rewritten me. I set my coat on the chair nearest the hallway, the seat closest to the exit. Old habit, operational awareness dressed up as shyness. Wren. Marlene's voice found me before her eyes did. She crossed the room with a wine glass already in hand, her smile wide and sharp and entirely for the audience. Sweetheart, we weren't sure you'd come. I live here, Marlene. She laughed, the kind of laugh designed to make the other person feel small. Well, technically. My sister Sarah stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a dish towel like a shield. She was 34 now, dark hair, nervous hands. She met my eyes for half a second and looked away. I understood. Marlene had gotten to her first. She always did. There were 11 people in the dining room, my father's old college friends, 2 of Marlene's social circle, Sarah's boyfriend, a quiet man named Greg, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, and Marlene herself stationed at the head of the table, my grandmother's seat. I said nothing. Everyone sit, Marlene said, waving a hand heavy with rings. Tonight is about family, about legacy, and about celebrating the people in this family who are actually building something. She raised her glass to Sarah, who just made associate partner at her firm, a real career, a real accomplishment. 11 glasses rose. Sarah blushed. She deserved the toast. She'd worked hard. But the emphasis on real landed exactly where Marlene intended it to land. On me. And Wren, Marlene continued, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that leaves a metallic taste in your mouth. We're just glad you're out of the house, honestly. After everything with the divorce, we were worried. If you've ever been underestimated by people who don't know the real story, hit that like button and subscribe. I folded my napkin beside my untouched plate. The roast chicken steamed, the candles flickered. I took a sip of water and said nothing. She's been through so much, Marlene said to the table, lowering her voice to that theatrical whisper designed to carry across every ear in the room. The marriage falling apart, the little consulting job drying up. You know she sits in a cubicle and pretends it's a war zone. Laughter, not from Sarah, but from enough of them. She handles documents, Marlene added, waving her fork. That's all. The Navy probably asked her to leave, if we're being honest. She turned to me. Wren, honey, no one's judging. We just think maybe it's time to be honest about where things stand. The military stories, the security clearance talk, well, she tilted her head, the gesture of a woman about to say something cruel and call it compassion. It's a little sad, a glorified secretary pretending the government needs her. Even the candle flame seemed to hesitate. I held my gaze, steady, level, the same gaze I'd held across encrypted briefing tables from admirals and intelligence directors in 4 countries. I work in analysis, Marlene. You work in delusion, sweetheart. She set her glass down and reached into her purse. The table went quiet. Sarah straightened in her chair. Marlene pulled out her phone like a magician revealing the final trick. I didn't want to do this tonight, she said. The room went still. But I think the family deserves to know who we're really dealing with. She tapped the screen, and then my own voice filled the dining room. It was me, crying, 6 months ago, the night my divorce was finalized. A private phone call from the Brownstones' second-floor study, the door closed, the windows shut. a moment I thought belonged only to me. Listen to that, Marlene said softly, playing the recording for the table. That is not a woman with a security clearance. That is not a woman the Navy trusts with anything. That is a broken woman playing soldier in a dead woman's brownstone. She looked around the room, gathering nods like currency. I sent this to people who care about the truth, she continued. A producer at Channel 4, Thomas Wright. He's very interested in the story of a woman pretending to be something she's not. Stolen valor is a real problem in this country, and I think it's time someone held Wren accountable. She painted a picture of a woman living in delusion, and the room believed her. Every head turned toward me. 11 sets of eyes filled with pity, suspicion, and something worse, agreement. My father's old friend Harold shook his head slowly. Greg stared at his plate. Sarah's eyes were wet, her mouth half open, caught between defense and doubt. Marlene leaned forward. So, Wren, do you want to tell everyone what you really do? Or should I let Thomas Wright do it for you tomorrow morning on the 6 o'clock news? The room waited. I didn't flinch. My hand stayed folded in my lap. My voice didn't shake. What they didn't know yet was that the woman sitting at the far end of the table, the quiet one with the untouched plate and the matte silver anchor pin on her lapel, had spent 15 years training people to trace exactly this kind of digital leak. 22 minutes, that's all it would take. I looked at Marlene. I looked at her phone. I looked at the 11 faces arranged around my grandmother's table in my grandmother's brownstone. And I reached, very slowly, for my bag. The bag was black, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd carry through an airport without a second glance. I'd packed it the same way I packed everything, with precision, with purpose, and with the quiet understanding that preparation is the only form of control that doesn't require permission. I set it on the table beside my untouched plate. The zipper was loud in the silence. 11 people watched me pull out a slim laptop, matte gray, no brand markings visible on the exterior. The kind of machine that doesn't show up in a Best Buy catalog. Marlene laughed. Oh, sweetheart, are you going to Google yourself to prove you're important? I didn't respond. I opened the lid. The blue glow of the monitor reflected in my eyes, caught the edge of my water glass, and painted a thin line of light across the tablecloth like a surgical incision. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the same cadence I'd used 10,000 times before. Not fast in the way civilians imagine fast. Not the frantic typing of a movie hacker. Steady, deliberate, each keystroke intentional, each query nested inside the last like Russian dolls built from pure mathematics. Wren, put that away, Marlene said. Her voice had shifted. Not much, just enough. The way a frequency shifts before a signal degrades. This isn't the time for your little computer games. I work in analysis. That's what I'd always told them. And right now, in this dining room, at my grandmother's table, surrounded by people who had spent 6 months swallowing Marlene's version of me like communion wine, I was doing exactly what I'd always done. Analyzing, first query, the audio file. Marlene had played it from her phone, which meant it existed as a digital file somewhere on her device. Every digital file carries metadata, date of creation, device used, duration, compression format, GPS coordinates embedded in the recording application's default settings. Marlene's phone was an off-the-shelf model, consumer grade, no encryption, no VPN. The recording app she'd used was the factory default, which meant every tag was intact. Second query, the transmission pathway. She said she'd sent it to Thomas Wright at Channel 4. Email. She would have used email. Marlene didn't understand encrypted file transfer. She didn't understand signal routing. She understood social leverage and volume and the assumption that being loud meant being right. The email headers would contain everything. sender EP recipient domain, timestamp attachment hash, third query, Title 18, United States Code, Section 2511, federal wiretapping, the interception and recording of oral communication without consent in a jurisdiction requiring two-party notification. The District of Columbia is a one-party consent jurisdiction for in-person conversations. But phone calls routed through federal infrastructure, calls made on lines connected to classified personnel, calls made inside a residence registered under an active, non-disclosed federal asset, those calls carried different rules. Rules Marlene had never heard of, rules that existed specifically because of people like me. What are you doing? Marlene's voice was louder now. She stood from her chair. The china rattled. Wren, I asked you a question. Working, I said. The screen filled with data. I parsed the email exchange in under 4 minutes. Marlene had contacted Thomas Wright at Channel 4 News on September 14th. She'd attached the audio file, a 47-second clip, along with a written statement describing me as a mentally unstable woman posing as a military intelligence officer. She'd included my full legal name, my address, the Brownstones' address, and a request for a segment she described as exposing stolen valor in our own backyard. Thomas Wright had responded within 6 hours. He was interested. He'd forwarded the file to his editorial director, a woman named Catherine Davis. Catherine had flagged it for a Friday broadcast. That broadcast was scheduled for tomorrow morning. I closed the first window, opened a second. My expression hadn't changed. My posture hadn't shifted. The only movement in my body was my fingers on the keys and the slow, even rhythm of my breathing. Wren, Sarah's voice, quiet, cautious. What are you looking at? Signal data. What does that mean? It means Marlene sent a recording of a classified officer's private communication to a commercial broadcast network using an unencrypted consumer email account. I paused. Let the sentence settle like dust after a detonation. That's a Class D federal felony. The room didn't react the way rooms react in movies. No one gasped. No one dropped a glass. Instead, there was a slow, spreading stillness, the kind that starts at the edges of a conversation and works inward like frost on a window. Marlene's lips parted, then closed, then parted again. You are not a classified officer, she said. But the certainty had cracked, a hairline fracture, barely visible. You work in data security. You sit in a cubicle. I didn't respond to that. I was already into the 7th minute. At minute 9, I isolated the recording device signature. Marlene had used a secondary phone, a prepaid unit purchased at a pharmacy on M Street. The GPS metadata placed the recording inside the Brownstones' second-floor study. My study. The room I'd been sitting in, alone, with the door closed, the night my marriage ended. She had been in the brownstone, while I was crying, standing outside my door with a phone pressed against the wood like a stethoscope against a dying man's chest. I processed that information the way I process all information. I filed it, tagged it, moved on. At minute 14, I had the full transmission chain, Marlene's prepaid phone to her primary email to Thomas Wright to Catherine Davis to the station's legal review queue, where it sat in a draft folder awaiting clearance. At minute 17, I drafted a federal complaint, 3 paragraphs. Title 18, Section 2511, Title 18, Section 1030. Unauthorized interception, unauthorized distribution, targeting a federal asset engaged in active, non-disclosed service. I attached the metadata, the email chain, the device signature, the GPS coordinates. At minute 19, I sent the complaint to a secure address I'd memorized 12 years ago. An address that doesn't auto-complete. an address that routes through servers no civilian search engine has ever indexed. At minute 20, I closed the laptop, folded my hands, looked at Marlene. "What did you just do?" she asked. "I work in analysis, Marlene. Right now, I'm analyzing the 5 distinct federal laws you just broke." Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. At minute 22, headlights swept across the front window. No one moved. The chandelier trembled. Even the fire crackling in the hearth seemed to quiet. Sarah set down her fork without a sound. Greg placed both hands flat on the table as if bracing for turbulence. The engine outside cut. 2 doors opened in rapid succession, then a third. Boots on the front steps. Not the shuffling of casual visitors. The measured, synchronized cadence of personnel trained to enter a space the way a scalpel enters tissue, with purpose, without apology. The brass knocker struck twice. Then the door opened without waiting for a response. 3 figures entered the brownstone's foyer. The first was a federal marshal, broad-shouldered, badge visible on his belt, hand resting near his hip with the relaxed discipline of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Officer Davis, 38, eyes that swept the room and cataloged every exit in under 2 seconds. The second was a woman in a dark blazer carrying a slim black case. Legal division. Her expression was as flat and readable as a classified stamp. The third man stopped the room cold. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of posture that makes you understand the phrase, "ramrod straight" isn't a metaphor. His dress blues carried more ribbons than anyone in that dining room had likely seen outside of a documentary. Gold braid on his shoulder boards, 2 stars clustered in a configuration that most civilians couldn't decode, but that spoke a very specific language to anyone who could. Rear Admiral Scott Miller, Director of Naval Intelligence, Cyber Command, my commanding officer during Operation Silvernet, the man who had personally signed my operational charter 11 years ago in a SCIF beneath the Pentagon. He didn't look at Marlene. Not at first. He looked at me. His gaze was steady, assessing. It tracked from my face to my collar, to the small matte silver anchor pin on my lapel, the one most people dismissed without a second glance, the one Marlene had once called that silly little brooch you wear to look important. This time, his gaze didn't skim past it. It stopped. It held. That pin wasn't decoration. It wasn't jewelry. It was a non-standard service award issued to exactly 41 intelligence officers across all branches for sustained contributions to signal security under the classification umbrella known internally as silent valor. You couldn't buy it, you couldn't replicate it, and you couldn't earn it without spending years in rooms that didn't exist on any floor plan. Admiral Miller straightened, his chin lifted by a fraction of a degree, and then he did something that rewrote every assumption in the room. He saluted, crisp, formal, textbook. His right hand rose to his brow with the precision of a man who had rendered this gesture 10,000 times and meant it every single time. He didn't salute Marlene. He didn't salute the marshal. He didn't address the 11 civilians staring at him with their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. He saluted me. Commander Ashford. His voice was level, clear, and carried the weight of an institution older than anything Marlene had ever tried to claim. Your signal was received. The breach is contained. We're taking over the scene. 11 forks stopped moving. The clink of silverware died. Harold's wine glass tilted in his hand, red pooling against the rim. Greg's mouth hung open. Sarah pressed both hands flat against the tablecloth, her fingertips white. And Marlene, who had spent the last 6 months constructing a story about a broken woman playing soldier in a dead woman's brownstone. Marlene, who had painted me as a glorified secretary. Marlene, who had stood in my grandmother's seat and raised a glass to everything I wasn't. The color drained from her face in a slow, visible tide, like watching a monitor lose signal. Her wine glass shook. Her lips moved, forming shapes that might have been words, but nothing came out. She reached for the back of her chair. Missed. Reached again. Her knees buckled. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens on television. Just a slow, mechanical failure, like a structure that had been bearing weight it was never designed to hold. She caught herself on the edge of the table. The good china rattled. A water glass tipped and rolled, sending a thin stream across the pale blue rim of my grandmother's plates. "Wait," she whispered. Her voice was stripped of every frequency it had carried all evening. No volume, no performance, no audience, just a woman standing in the wreckage of her own architecture. "Wait, you weren't just crying on that call. You were on a secure line?" Admiral Miller didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on me. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we're here to extract you." Admiral Miller held the salute for 3 full seconds. I rose from my chair. Slowly, the way you rise when the weight you've been carrying for 15 years finally has a witness. I returned the salute. Crisp. Controlled. The muscle memory of 1,000 mornings in rooms no one in this dining room could imagine. He lowered his hand first. Protocol: a rear admiral does not hold a salute longer than the officer he's addressing unless rendering honors to the fallen. He wasn't rendering honors. He was confirming identity. And every second of that exchange communicated a language Marlene had never learned to speak. "At ease, Commander," he said. Not warmth, not sentiment, precision, the vocal equivalent of a lock tumbling open. Officer Davis stepped forward. The federal marshal moved through the dining room the way a current moves through still water, quietly, inevitably. He stopped 2 feet from Marlene. His badge caught the candlelight. "Marlene Ashford?" His voice was flat, professional, the kind of voice that has delivered this sentence so many times it no longer carries emotion. She didn't answer. She was still staring at Admiral Miller's ribbons. Counting them, maybe, or trying to understand a visual language she'd spent 60 years ignoring. "Marlene Ashford," Davis repeated. "I'm placing you under federal arrest. Title 18, United States Code, Section 2511. Unauthorized interception and distribution of oral communication involving a classified federal officer. You have the right to remain silent." The irony of that last sentence settled over the room like smoke. Marlene's mouth opened. The first phase of collapse. "I didn't know. She never said. I thought she was just..." "Ma'am, hands behind your back, please." She looked at me. For the first time all evening, she actually looked at me. Not at the version she'd constructed. Not at the glorified secretary or the broken divorcee or the delusional woman playing soldier. At me. I held my gaze, steady, level, the same way I'd held it across briefing tables in 4 countries, the same way I'd held it when she called me a fraud 45 minutes ago. The handcuffs were quiet. Not the theatrical click of a movie, just a soft mechanical sound, the sound of a system engaging. "This is a mistake," Marlene said. Her voice was in phase 2 now, stammering, fractured. "She's my niece, and this is a family matter. You can't just..." "Ma'am!" Davis guided her toward the door. This stopped being a family matter when you transmitted a classified officer's private communication to a commercial broadcast network. The woman in the dark blazer, legal division, placed a slim black folder on the table in front of Admiral Miller. He opened it, scanned the contents. His expression didn't change, but the muscles along his jaw tightened by a degree that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would notice. "Commander Ashford," he said, "the complaint has been processed. NSA Legal has flagged the transmission chain. Channel 4 has been served a national security letter. The segment has been killed." He turned a page. The metadata analysis you conducted has been entered into evidence. Your trace identified the recording device, the upload pathway, the email exchange, and the Title 18 violation in 22 minutes. He paused. That's faster than most of my analysts at Cyber Command. I said nothing. Additionally, he continued, and his voice dropped half a register, the broadcast of that recording, had it aired, would have placed your cover identity in a public database searchable by foreign intelligence services currently monitoring open source media for references to NSA-affiliated personnel. He closed the folder. 3 active operations would have been compromised. 2 liaison officers embedded in allied naval networks would have required immediate extraction. 1 ongoing signal intercept in the Baltic theater, the operation you built the encryption architecture for, would have been burned. He looked at Marlene, who was standing between Davis and the doorway, her wrists locked behind her, her rings catching light they no longer deserved. 2 allied assets compromised. 1 active operation burned, 6 months of signal intelligence lost. His voice carried no anger. Something worse, accounting. Because you recorded a phone call. Marlene swayed. Phase 3. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words, just the mechanical failure of a woman whose entire framework of assumptions had collapsed beneath her. I didn't mean to. My voice cut the room cleanly. Not loud, not sharp, just present. For the first time all evening, fully present. But you did. 3 words, my own paragraph. The silence that followed was louder than anything Marlene had said all night. Admiral Miller turned back to me. His expression shifted nearly imperceptibly. Not softness, recognition, the recognition of a commanding officer who understood what the last 6 months had cost. Commander, he said, before we proceed, I need to verify something for the record. He paused. Operation Silvernet, the Baltic Protocol. When you designed the encryption subroutine for the Allied Fleet Communication Overlay, which key rotation interval did you implement for Layer 3 packet authentication? A verification question. Something only I would know. Something that existed in no database any civilian could access. I didn't hesitate. 90-second intervals, staggered across a 7-node relay architecture with asymmetric fallback to a 45-second cycle, if any single node reported latency drift exceeding 11 milliseconds. Miller nodded. Once, almost imperceptibly, it wasn't approval, it was memory. The memory of a skiff beneath the Pentagon at 3 a.m. 2 years ago, when I'd presented that exact architecture to a room of 12 people who collectively held enough clearance to reclassify the sun. Confirmed, he said. He turned to the legal officer. Log it. Commander Ashford's identity and operational status verified. I looked at Sarah. She was crying. Not the performative tears Marlene deployed like weapons. Real tears. The kind that fall when someone you love turns out to be someone you never understood. Why didn't you tell us? She whispered. The room waited for an explanation, an apology, a justification. They didn't get one. You didn't ask, Sarah. I paused. Let the words land. And even if you had, you wouldn't have believed it. Not because the truth was unbelievable, because Marlene's version was easier. I turned to the table. 11 faces, some pale, some flushed, all silent. You spent your life making everything loud, Marlene. My voice was even, controlled. The voice I used in briefing rooms and SCIFs and encrypted conference calls with people whose names appeared in no directory. But some things grow more powerful the quieter they are. I don't need your approval to exist. I just need you to stay out of my signal. Marlene said nothing. Phase 4. Complete verbal collapse. Officer Davis guided her through the doorway. Her heels clicked unevenly on the brownstone's hardwood. The brass knocker rattled as the door closed behind her. The brownstone exhaled. The thing about silence is that it isn't always passive. Sometimes silence is the sharpest answer. Admiral Miller collected the folder. The legal officer snapped her case shut. Davis would process Marlene downtown. The charges would stand: Class D federal felony, unauthorized interception and distribution of classified personnel communication. No family interference, no special considerations. Commander, Miller said at the door, your leave is approved through the end of the month. After that, we'll need you back at Meade. The Baltic Protocol enters Phase 3 in January. Understood, sir. He paused. His hand rested on the doorframe, the same doorframe my grandmother had touched every morning for 40 years. Your grandmother would have been proud, he said. Quietly, not for the room. For me. I adjusted the anchor pin on my collar and said nothing. Some things don't require a response to be received. The door closed. The SUV's engine turned over. The headlights swept across the window and disappeared down Marlowe Street. I stood in the dining room of the Ashford brownstone. My grandmother's table, my grandmother's china, my chair. Sarah approached slowly. She didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't apologize for Marlene. She just stood beside me and placed her hand on the table, inches from mine. I'm proud of you, she said. No conditions, no advice, just that. I exhaled. For the first time in years, Marlene's arraignment was held 11 days later. The courtroom was small, federal jurisdiction, no cameras, no Thomas Wright from Channel 4. The station had killed the segment within 3 hours of receiving the national security letter. Catherine Davis, the editorial director, issued a formal retraction of all materials received. Thomas Wright resigned quietly 2 weeks later. His name appeared in no further broadcast credits. Marlene pleaded not guilty. Her attorney, a man named Philip Taylor, who specialized in reducing felonies to misdemeanors through procedural technicalities, filed 3 motions to dismiss. Each was denied. The metadata was clean. The transmission chain was irrefutable. The evidence had been gathered by one of the most qualified digital forensics officers in the United States Navy, and it held up under every challenge because I had built it the way I built everything, with precision, without apology. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Anderson, issued a Class D felony conviction for unauthorized wiretapping of a classified federal officer, 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, a permanent restraining order barring Marlene from the Ashford brownstone, from my personal communications, and from any contact with me, direct or indirect, for the duration of 10 years. The family fractured the way families fracture when the foundation they were standing on turns out to be someone else's lie. Harold stopped attending gatherings. 2 of Marlene's social circle quietly distanced themselves when the federal charges became a matter of public record. My father's old friend sent no messages, no calls, no letters. I didn't go to Thanksgiving that year, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because I no longer needed to step into a place that asked me to shrink. 3 months after the conviction, I converted the brownstone's ground floor into something new: the Ashford Privacy Clinic pro bono digital security consultations for veterans and survivors of domestic surveillance. I built the intake system myself, encrypted, anonymized, designed to protect the kind of people who had been recorded, tracked, and exposed by the people who claimed to love them. 217 clients in the first year. Veterans whose ex-spouses had installed tracking software on their phones, abuse survivors whose private messages had been weaponized in custody battles, people who understood, the way I understood, that privacy isn't secrecy. Privacy is sovereignty. The clinic's front door had no sign, no logo, just the address and a small brass plate that read, Ashford, by appointment. Some things don't need to announce themselves to be powerful. 6 months after the clinic opened, I walked through a door that didn't appear on any floor plan. The SCIF at Fort Meade was exactly as I remembered it. Blue monitors, recycled air, the low hum of servers processing data at volumes that would make a civilian hard drive melt. I sat at my workstation. The same chair, the same keyboard. The matte silver anchor pin on my collar caught the blue light from the monitor. A junior analyst 2 stations over glanced up. "Morning, ma'am. Welcome back." "Morning." No title, no rank announcement, no ceremony, just Wren, sitting in the quiet, doing the work that keeps the signal clean. There is power in patience. There is freedom in truth, even if it comes late. And there is a kind of strength that doesn't ask to be seen, doesn't need to be heard, and doesn't break no matter how loud the noise gets. My name is Wren Ashford, Commander, United States Navy, Cyber Warfare Engineer, NSA Liaison. Call sign, Whiskey 7. I am no longer missing. Silence was never my weakness. Silence was my signal, and the signal was always clear. If you enjoyed this story about quiet competence, winning over loud arrogance, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.